Great. We are all here. So welcome everybody. It is 1:01 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'm in Bloomington, Indiana, and my name is Joanna Veronkovich, and I'm one of the co-directors of the Arts Entrepreneurship and Innovation Lab here at the Center for Cultural Affairs. We have a really exciting panel right now, and I'm so happy to be the moderator of it. We're talking about community and engagement. And before we get started, how about we go around the room and just briefly introduce ourselves. I'm going to start with Amaka.
Hi everyone, my name is Amaka Agbo, and I'm with Amaka Agbo Consulting based out of Oakland, California. And I use the pronouns she and her. Thank you. Thanks for having me, Joanna.
Thanks, Amaka, for being here. And Tali. Oh, looks like we can't hear Tali right now. So how about while Tali gets her audio sorted out?
Now?
There we go. Hi, Tali.
Okay. Sorry about that. Hi, my name is Tali Katzgero. I'm very happy to be here and to participate in this event. So thank you, Joanna and Doug, for inviting me. I'm a sociologist based at the University of Haifa in Israel. In my work, I'm interested in cultural consumption, cultural policy, and comparing between countries.
Great, thanks for being here, Tali. Alan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alan Brown. I live in the great city of Detroit, Michigan, and I'm a researcher and consultant in the arts and culture sector. Delighted to be with you.
Thanks, Alan, for being here. And how about Peter?
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Joanna. I'm Peter Lynette. I'm calling in from Santa Fe, which is the traditional homeland of the Tewa Pueblo and the Tanos Pueblo. My professional life is based in Chicago at the firm Slover Lynette Audience Research. So we're a social research practice. I just want to say, Joanna and Doug, what a great panel you put together in the first round earlier today. It was tremendous, as were some of the many of the pre-recorded talks. So thank you for including me.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And finally, Mark.
I'm Mark Shapiro. I'm humbled to be among this group and definitely feel like the outlier, both intellectually and experience-wise. Just a sports guy. I've been working in baseball for almost 30 years. Live in Toronto, Canada, and I'm the CEO and president of the Blue Jays.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for being here today. I just want to remind the attendees that we will be taking questions near the end of the panel. So you can either send in your questions via Twitter at our Twitter handle at CCA O'Neill, #AEI2020, or send in those questions via email ccaoneil@indiana.edu. We also have backstage at AEI, a Zoom room going on, and you can get to that room by going to our website and clicking the link. So we'll be taking questions from all three of those places near the end of the panel. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started. We have some amazing keynote presentations that Mark and Amaka were part of that are already posted to our website and our event page that really start to put forward some provocative ideas and questions. And I want to just start with having our panelists respond to those keynotes. So in Amaka's keynote, she talks about the structural challenges to marginalized communities that the pandemic has really helped lay bare. Especially in regard to where the concentration of power lies within a capitalistic climate. And then we saw Mark's keynote, and he clearly outlines the challenges that the sports industry is facing due to the pandemic with regard to figuring out how to sustain a multi-billion-dollar industry that supports a diverse and multi-layered system of communities. So this includes staff, athletes, and fans. So I'm going to start with Tali, if that's okay with you. And then how about we move on to Alan and then Peter. Can you just talk about the challenges and hardships you're observing in your work with regard to communities, which you believe are attributable to how the pandemic has changed our way of life?
Thank you for the question, Joanna. And I'd like to start by thanking Amaka and Mark for the contributions, which were really interesting. I would like to echo some of what they said and to reiterate that society is probably going to change in radical ways. And we have to acknowledge that, as the title of this event is, it's not going to be back to normal. Billions of people are in lockdown at the same time in different parts of the world. And this makes us feel that we are part of the same problem and that we should address it all together. And this means that we need more solidarity and to move away from cultural prejudice. And this really resonates with the concept of restorative economics. Of course, we have to remember that vulnerable, underprivileged groups, such as women, communities of color, immigrants, low-income groups, children, youth, the elderly, the homeless, all of them experience the pandemic very differently. COVID-19 is exacerbating existing inequalities because these groups are being hit harder as they have less access to healthcare and more difficulties self-isolating. And these inequalities are also evident when thinking about cultural participation and cultural engagement. And I separate the two deliberately. For instance, vulnerable groups tend to have less access to public spaces and to green spaces, public or private. Green spaces in lower income neighborhoods are often smaller, under-maintained, less numerous than those in wealthier neighborhoods. Public spaces are really important for providing social interactions that mitigate isolation and loneliness. And these are places where some forms of cultural activities happen. So the epidemic accentuates the difference between what's important and what's not. And one thing that I would like to really emphasize is that we should remember that the arts and culture sector is an extremely important one, both because it represents the morals, values, and spirit of society, but also because it is a major economic market and we have billions of people employed and a lot of money contributed to the economy. So access to art and culture and the ability of different social groups to engage in them is really important both for individuals and for communities and society in general, because such engagement is the backbone of solidarity, of integration, and of inclusion. And returning to business as usual will not deliver a sustained long-term recovery that also improves well-being and reduces inequality. And maybe later on we can talk more about the link between cultural engagement and various aspects of well-being. And maybe I'll stop here for now.
How about we move on to Alan?
Thanks, Tally, and thanks, Joanna. Hi, everyone. Gosh, there's so much to respond to. Let me just first begin by saying that back in early March, when people were kind of panicking and managing, doing triage. Mark, you're not alone in doing triage. It occurred to me that we really need to hear from audiences when things turn around and when facilities are able to reopen. We need to hear from community members. So I very quickly put together what is now the COVID-19 Audience Outlook Monitor Study. You can find out more about that at audienceoutlookmonitor.com. We're really still gearing up. We've deployed surveys in 5 or 6 cities. We've got about 10 more to go. We're in Australia, Canada, Norway, and potentially several other countries. So it's interesting because we're seeing results from countries where the situation is way different than in ours. And I guess, communities like Joanna, we're researching audience members, actually, which is a really poor proxy for communities, because we're not talking to people who don't already patronize cultural institutions. And I think, Peter, maybe you can go into this a little bit, because I know you are, but if anything, like, this is the missing link is, initially our study was just like, are people going to come back? How can we get people back? And now with the racial justice movement that we're seeing, I think there's a whole new set of questions that delve very deeply into moral imperatives. I think we're seeing a failure of cultural policy in not having mechanisms for communities to set collective priorities, but rather allowing the Wild West of institutions to dominate what is produced. We're seeing a failure of strategic planning, in that our strategic planning for years has never even tolerated multiple viewpoints on what the future should look like. So we've not allowed a plurality of voices to the table. And only now are we discovering what scenario planning is. And that's something we need to learn a lot about. So Mark, I was intrigued by your comment about grappling with shorter attention spans. But believe us, that's something that we think about all the time in arts and culture. It's a difficult conversation, whether to allow people with devices to use devices during cultural events, and a deep belief system that our job is to teach people how to pay attention. So maybe we're training your next generation of sports fans. So there's so much to talk about. The harm in our communities is so great. I've done a deep analysis of the sector here in southeastern Michigan. I'm not really authorized to talk about that yet, except maybe in broad generalities, but there are significant percentages of organizations that are in sort of 50 flavors of insolvency, running out of cash, figuring out whether to completely hibernate in order to live to see another day. The effect of the pandemic on the African-American community here in Detroit has been devastating, much, much worse than the white community. And I'm not yet seeing efforts by leadership in the cultural community to make choices about who gets support. I'm seeing little relief checks going out, which do not even begin to approach the systemic problems, that we need. So I'll close by just saying that, before we were just focusing on audiences and when they'll come back, and now we're focusing on why are we restoring institutions that were built around white privilege, and how can we fundamentally alter our course as a field. So that's my initial provocation.
Thanks, Alan. Peter.
Yeah, I agree, Alan. This is a time for research as listening. I think research and evaluation have traditionally been part of the problem, what was called in the last panel monoculture, right? Maintaining or extending exactly that white privilege, that European set of definitions, and that very narrow sort of value-laden but pretending toward universality set of values. I think it's really clear that the dis-ease that Mark with Joseph talks about is one thing. It is not just the virus over here and George Floyd and Black Lives Matter over here. It's an integrated pain and illness. So the question is, how can research help, right? And I feel like, Amaka, your framing, which is so beautiful, and I found your talk really inspiring. You're asking at the macro level the question that I've been trying to ask at the cultural sector level, which is of course one subsystem in the broader notion that you've been painting. And I guess I'm curious about what you say about cultural power, which you in one of your slides describe as the outer ring, the precondition for all the other kinds of power that need to be distributed and shared and lived in a more equitable and co-creative way. So I'm trying to figure out the link. Is it just a linguistic accident that the field that Alan and I and some of us work in is called culture? Is that a different definition than the sense in which you're using the word? I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. And I have a big sort of pressing question that flows from that, which is about reparations, because you're talking about repair. And I think the moment that we're in is potentially an accelerant of a reckoning that was long overdue, and that was just being, sort of unpacked and talked about across the world of museums and arts and culture organizations prior to all of this. So I'm trying to see some good in it eventually, but I just want to thank you for that. And we could talk about what the reparations or apologies might be for. I have some thoughts about that.
Should I jump in, Joanna, or yeah? Cool. Well, thanks, Peter. I appreciate that, and thank you all for your comments. Like some of the speakers have alluded to, I come from a long-term social racial justice organizing background, working on policy, electoral politics, community organizing. And the framework of restorative economics is one that is intentionally rooted in a framework of reparations and restorative justice. And so when you bring up this piece around culture, Peter, I try to be intentional about referring to it as cultural power, because to the point that Tali raised, culture is about our norms and our values, our beliefs, our faiths, and how those get reproduced in society through different systems over and over again. And the power piece is important because it calls us to really question who gets to produce and who gets to own. And so once again, what are the cultural norms that get validated in institutions through museums, through music, through celebrations out in the community? And for me, I think if we wanted to kind of talk about why this is important in the framework of reparations, it was only within the last few years that we got the African American Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. The Smithsonian being a long-term institution that's had a way of really documenting the history, the experiences of people from a number of different cultures. And given the 400-year legacy that the United States has around enslavement, around genocide of indigenous communities and Black communities, only now actually having a space that's dedicated to documenting not only the pain and suffering, but also looking at the ways that Black people have figured out how to celebrate and have joy within all that pain and suffering. And so reparations is important because it invites us into really sitting with the acknowledgement of the harm that was done, because we actually can't go to something that is more just, more equitable without knowing what that actually looks like and what we're trying to repair. And that, once again, reparations has to actually be supported by action. And so, yes, I think apologies and acknowledgement are a good place to start, but then it calls us in to have specific choices around when and how we make interventions to ensure that we don't repeat the same harms, and to also ensure that we are providing those same communities that have been disproportionately impacted the skills, the tools, the resources that they need to be able to kind of engage in a more dignified livelihood. And I think for me, as we start to think about what this means when we think about arts and culture in this moment, even to think about sports in this moment, I continue to come back to, what does it mean to have collective care? What does it mean to actually have a strong social safety net where artists, the vendors that, I love to go to the Oakland A's games. I love to go to the Warriors games when they were still in Oakland. And the fact that we could have those individuals working a minimum wage, right? What's the minimum that you need to survive rather than a living wage? How do we ensure that you have access to quality housing, access to education, access to the healthcare benefits so that you as a cultural worker, you as somebody who wants to support the sports industry has a baseline. And from there, right, you can build up on it. I think for me, one of the things that has been innovative and exciting in this moment has been watching so many artists figure out how to actually take their work online, and really also figuring out how moving to online virtual spaces creates a level of accessibility that we oftentimes haven't been called into or required of us before. And so I think that there's also a way for us to really lean into how the moment is inviting us to be more intentional and thoughtful about what all of us need in terms of collective care, but then how we also use a lot of the technologies and innovations that we've benefited from to help ensure that cultural workers have a larger platform, can reach bigger audiences, and that they're resourced appropriately for their work, and that they also then get to have power and say over how their work is reproduced and sustained. And so, yeah, I'll get off my soapbox, but thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Amaka. My next question was about commonalities across all of our fields, especially in regards to challenges and hardships we're seeing. But I think you just went right ahead and started talking about those. Amaka's framework, honestly, from your keynote, really gives us a sense of commonality to reference to. So it's funny. I want to hear a little bit from Mark, because you talk about the challenges that the sports industry is facing, and while from the creative sector standpoint, we tend to always put sort of sports against arts. Arts are different than sports, et cetera. But to me, it seems like there are so many more commonalities than we would even notice. So one of the points, for example, that Tali made is this idea of these two forms of engagement helping us socially engage. So I guess I want to know from Mark, what are you thinking about when it comes to this word community? Are you trying to interrogate that word moving forward now that our world has changed so much? Are you thinking about your fans differently? Like, who were your communities before this happened to who are your communities right now?
Well, again, I think it's a bit overwhelming and challenging to kind of talk about sports in light of Amaka's comments and some of the other comments being made. It feels a little mundane and a little embarrassing, frankly. I will say, just to preface that answer, Joanna, that listen, the baseball and sports world is one of routine. 29 straight years of kind of doing the same thing. The universal, and I mean that in the most literal sense, challenge that we're all facing is one that has massively interrupted, that world. And then on top of that, the racial and social justice movement, which is, so necessary. And I will say this, if you could ever look through the lens of Canada, I moved here 5 years ago, and if you could ever see what race looks like, at least in the city of Toronto, I think without being able to undo history and systemic issues, there is hope. My children have been raised the second half of their lives without a framework or a thought of race and color and ethnicity and international. That's what exists here. So there is hope. I think it's hard to undo history and hard to undo injustice, particularly the ultimate injustice of bondage. And that to Native Americans, but I'm hopeful. Being here gives me hope. When I think about my job, the first thing I think about is protecting the 500 to 1,300 people that work for us in a time of uncertainty and anxiety that we all face. And when Alan referenced triage, it's how do we just take care of our people first? The ability to think about the long term of our business, which is exactly what you're talking about and what Alan referenced as far as attention spans, changing the game, recognizing what not just sports, live entertainment. The live entertainment industry is going to be disrupted and will be massively changed in the short term. It was already undergoing a massive long-term change because of attention spans, because of mobility, because of technology, and a lot of those lines between accessibility and how do you grow fan bases, and how do you step outside of tradition, and how do you understand what it truly means to embrace, court, and bring in new communities and new fans is a lot of what we were thinking about, Joanna, when we were thinking about long-term. I will be honest with you, I'm not thinking long-term right now. I'm thinking survival right now, but all of my efforts within my industry cap on this, the competition committee to the strategic planning committee of MLB ownership groups, have been focused on answering those questions. What does entertainment and the sport look like inside of the stadium? How do we think about distribution, of our entertainment outside of the stadium? How do we define community? Because that word's very different. How do we define family without putting traditional labels on those things? And how do we make our environment one that is not just interesting or welcoming, but compelling for people to come? And I think baseball is the one professional sport that does offer a sense of community within the stadium. It's diverse here for the game, which is not very diverse in the fan base, but it's also one that plays out slowly without a lot of loud noise and allows for interaction and kind of fosters conversation in between and around the game. So I know I rambled and I know I didn't kind of directly address your point, but it's so hard to address your point with the realities of the backdrop of the world right now. And those are the things I'm kind of hierarchy. I'm working through a hierarchy of protect mental health, protect our people, their well-being, their ability to protect, to feed their families and kind of continue at every level of our organization, protect and ensure our business has any level of sustainability in wake of this, massive reality. And then with what little time's left, I can get back to thinking about the long-term viability and health of the game, which I can talk about because it's all we were thinking about prior to this disruption. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think you speak to a lot of what we're hearing from our attendees today, which is how do I focus long-term when I just need to focus on staying alive at this point? Tali, I want to recognize your hand, your digital hand.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to follow up on that and say that I think that we should think of culture and tourism and the creative industries and design and sports together, because all of them create a spillover of culture onto productivity and education and forms of human, social, and cultural capital. And this is what's being disrupted now. And this is why we have a change to think about, as Peter said, restoring institutions in a different way. And Amaka talked about community stewardship, community governance, but we have to be aware of the significant institutional barriers. And those are really, really difficult to overcome. And these barriers create inequalities in the way individuals are able to translate or convert their cultural competencies to educational, occupational, social benefits, especially in times of crisis. And this is the danger of the reproduction of privilege. So we have to really concentrate on the crisis as an opportunity to change these institutions and the way they work. And another point I wanted to raise, maybe to inject some optimism. I think it is perhaps too early to say that, but I'm going to speculate and bear with me on that. I think that the new situation we are in calls for rethinking some of the dichotomies or binary formulations we've been working with. The dichotomies between consumers and producers. Because all of a sudden we see consumers of culture turning into producers of culture in their homes. The dichotomy between urban and rural is being blurred, between culture that is done online and offline, and even the dichotomy between highbrow culture and lowbrow culture. All these are being blurred. And perhaps the bright side is that formalized forms of cultural participation now make way to more home-based and family-based forms. So if we think of culture in the broadest sense, playing sports, playing cards, board games, online cultural consumptions of plays and operas and museums, children taking drawing lessons via Zoom, arts and crafts, creating memes, writing blogs. All of these are all of a sudden receive a much more important position in people's lives. And maybe this is a way for us to start rethinking the way we bring communities together around joint cultural projects and trying to think of ways to change some of these institutions and systems.
Tali, I agree, but wasn't that all happening for the last couple decades? I mean, you may be right that, as I said earlier, it's sort of an accelerant right now, but those blurrings and that disintermediation of culture such that the institution plays not always a central role anymore, it has been a long upwelling.
Well, it really depends on the context. And in some countries, it's really not very significant because the institutions are extremely strong, extremely conservative, and extremely stable. But also there's the point of acceleration and things, processes that have been happening for the past decade or 5 years, all of a sudden are bursting. And yeah, maybe this is something we can elaborate on later on.
Alan.
Joanna, maybe I'm moving forward too quickly here, but you know, we have known for so long that we need new models. You know, it's been widely acknowledged, yet we don't have them. And you know, the cultural norms that Tali is talking about that are so hard to change. You know, who was it who famously said there's nothing worse than, you know, wasting a crisis? You know, there will be people who say, you know, can we just solve one crisis at a time? Can we get back to kind of, you know, normal? And frankly, at the beginning of this, I was very skeptical about all the people running around like Chicken Little saying, oh, it's all going to be completely different now. And I thought, really? Because actually a lot of consumers just want to get back to consuming what they used to consume before the pandemic hit. Because now the normals, you know, returning to normalcy is such a prized thing. But over the past sort of month and a half, it's really become apparent to me that actually, you know, now is the time for paradigmatic change. And you know, the conditions in which paradigmatic change are possible are so rare, right? Adrian Ellis calls it the Overton window, you know, widen, you know, people are able to have conversations they were not able to have previously. But we've been having these conversations. So, you know, I just want to put like a couple of issues on the table, like facilities. Like Mark, you got facilities, right? They are fixed. Boy, are they fixed. You know, they change every 50 years. Maybe. And we got facilities. Our facilities were designed with a certain kind of experience for a certain kind of people in mind. And they're not suiting us very well, many of them. You know, and I think now, you know, now would be the time for us to challenge the community of architects and designers and acousticians and theater consultants to actually reimagine cultural facilities with equity in mind. So that we don't have for another 30 years, 2,000 seat auditoriums designed for white art. How do we break that chain? So I want to get that on the table. And then, this need for new models, like deconstructing. I mean, I've been listening to webinars, by different fields. And, it's very clear that now is the time actually for us to be experimenting with new models that address what Amaka says is, collective ownership, new models of collective ownership. Like, what does that look like? Like, what does a music producing organization look like based on collective ownership? Is it an orchestra? Is it an opera? What does a community like Detroit need from an opera company? It's time. So I would call on philanthropy to create greenhouse sites where we can experiment with new models, wipe it out, remove the risk of failure, and try something new, and do it in multiple locations, and stop making one site, one-off experiments, grant-funded experiments. So sorry, I don't mean to indict philanthropy here. They're doing so much to help. But I really think we have to get practical here about entering a space where we can experiment with institutional models and facilities, that will propel us forward as a field.
And Alan, I just want to add, I agree with what you're putting on the table, and it's really important. I think that the new models of governance of sort of service need to precede the buildings by a long way. Meaning it's premature to be talking to the architects at the moment, but you're teeing up a whole sequence of rethings. And I just want to acknowledge that I too have been learning over the last couple months that restarting is not the main goal here, right? It can't be, because then we miss the entire sort of impulse that the Black Lives Matter unrest and tragedies have forced to the fore, but which were there to begin with, meaning if we're not going to transform now, we're never going to transform. And the arts, the cultural sector has this, I guess what I'm grappling with as a researcher is that, when we do these studies and we see how white the lists, the networks, the participating communities, if you will, of cultural organizations across this country, rural, urban, large, small, they're incredibly whiter than the population. Now, of course, there are exceptions. But the general scene that we've discovered to our, horror in this national study that we're in the midst of is the question, because if the problems right now are cultural, meaning racism is clearly a cultural problem, justice is going to be a cultural discussion. So then what does the cultural sector need to do? And right now it's starting from a position of historical lack of standing, because of this disproportionate whiteness. It's not serving all communities equitably. It never has, right? So, I mean, I want to get back to baseball too for a second. But Alan, any thoughts about that, or Joanna?
I'll let Alan speak. And then I want to move it to Amaka. She's had her hand up for a little while.
Oh, sorry.
Your response.
I yield to Amaka.
Great, Amaka.
Thank you. I think what is coming up for me, because we're kind of dancing around it, but I think we just need to talk about it pointedly. It's the question of where culture creates profit, right? So many of the different spaces, and we talk about culture sitting within institutions, but who is profiting and where is that money getting made, and then who is ultimately accumulating a level of wealth and power off of that culture. I would say that, this piece around what happens to cultural preservation when we're all kind of sheltering in place, for me, as someone who was raised Nigerian American, I always experienced my cultures and my traditions within my home. with my family or directly with my communities. It was never something that I expected to walk out into the street and to see replicated or celebrated in kind of a majority white society. And so all this to say is I think the opportunity to actually look to those cultural producers or those spaces in which undocumented immigrant communities, Black communities that have been heavily policed, all those places where communities have been alienated and dislocated from the rest of society, to understand, well, how have they maintained culture and traditions and ways of being together in spite of the ways that unfortunately they have not been able to necessarily profit off of their culture. And so, for me, an example of this is, I grew up out of the hip hop culture of graffiti and breakdancing and MC rapping. And those are all things that were heavily policed and criminalized. And so then to see the mayor of DC doing a placemaking project where they kind of paint Black Lives Matters in yellow words, pointing down to the White House, to kind of see a graffiti, something that has been criminalized, right? Also now being a place where we're using it to make a political statement, I think is interesting to once again figure out where are those places where we've seen art and culture really engage in society in these particular ways. And while unfortunately they may have not been profitable, they've helped to kind of push and create shifts. So when we, once again, I think it was Peter who had raised the question of how do we start to really rethink the facilities and the spaces, I think that there's learning that we can look to. And so much of the ways oftentimes we can be trained is to kind of create something new, but I actually think we get to reclaim what we call the Sankofa, the going back and learning from. And so I think for me, the other piece that's coming up, and Mark, I would say I empathize with the sports industry as someone who, I ran track and field in college. I couldn't imagine running a race with an empty stadium. Like it just doesn't have the same push. You're not going to PR, set a personal record in that environment. And all that to say, so much of where art or sports has existed has been in the private sector. And so what does it look like to also kind of engage people who have disproportionately accumulated wealth throughout the vertical of that industry? What does it look like to also kind of engage it in more of a public sector realm when we think about who now owns these stadiums, who carries the debt on these stadiums, many of them being cities that cannot be used or are being repurposed for public health spaces as they should be. But I think the opportunity, once again, to hopefully engage the community, the broader community, the public sector, and also rethinking the use of these facilities, how to support the seasonal workers that help to sustain those facilities, and then how to engage the specific athletes themselves is an opportunity to think about the sports industry not just being individual wealth building, right, but also kind of continuing to deepen culture and deepen the engagement of community more broadly.
Thanks, Amaka. Tali, I want to push it over to you because you have something to say, I see.
Thank you. I think that the question whether things will go back to normal is, the question that all of us are obsessed about these days, and policymakers are dying to know what will happen, whether people will just go back to participating in full force in consumer culture and doing whatever they were doing before the pandemic. But a general potential consequence of COVID-19 is, for example, a generalized aversion to large crowds. Like we have in concerts hall, in cultural events, sporting events, ceremonies, markets, political protests. All these bring many people together in public places, and in the immediate future, these gatherings will be restricted. And what will happen long term? Will people develop a permanent aversion to large public gatherings? And this is important because it means that we might have to change how cities are designed, as some of you have already alluded to. So the spatial organization of cultural activities within a country, within a region, is highly likely to change. For example, also because of domestic demand. because we can't travel abroad as we used to. The balance between rural and urban areas could shift as regions outside big cities have been suffering from drain of human and financial resources, but perhaps now can become an important places for social experiments. So I agree that it's really a wonderful opportunity for us to, I would say, like I would use the title of an OECD document that was published 3 days ago. The title is Building Back Better. So we want to build back, we want to rebuild, but we have to put our minds together around how to do that better. For example, by using big data, engineering of data, redistributing funds and subsidies and strengths of different regions in the country. And I think that what is going to change perhaps permanently is that people are going to require 2 things: safety and trust. Trust will be very important. The demand for safety will be very important. And I think this will have significant consequence for the way we rebuild those cultural institutions.
Thanks, Tali. I just want to remind the audience, the attendees, that you can send in questions via Twitter or our email. I'm starting to get some now, so I do want to turn over to some of those. But I wanted to ask you about new models, new structures, new systems, because that's what a lot of the questions that are actually coming from our attendees are asking about. You've talked about a lot of them. You've talked about, Amaka, you talked about, this isn't new, but it's something that the cultural sector is not as familiar with, the idea that we practice our culture and our traditions in our homes, right? I think this relates very much to what we have been hearing from the sports industry about the idea of no fans in the stadiums, right? Alan, you used the word audience, but you had a kind of a general kind of aversion to that term. So maybe we start using a new term. Philanthropic experiments, Alan, you also mentioned. So I want to just ask the panel, and this is related to a question we got from Bente Bouthier at WFIU. Sorry for that name pronunciation. But what do you suggest that different venues, organizations consider as they adapt and look for new models to reach people, to reach their communities? And what unique problems do these types of organizations and venues face? And anybody can feel free to jump in here.
Well, this is sort of meta, but I would say that the framing of the question is that the organization / venue makes the decisions. And that's exactly what I think is at stake in what comes next. It's certainly what you pointed us to, Amaka, and it's what Bamuthi earlier this morning talks about. There's got to be a sense of collectivism in the decision-making around what constitutes relevance, what constitutes service, and all of that is culture.
Amaka, do you have something to say?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in, and Mark, would love for your thoughts on this, because for me, I think the piece is who gets to decide and how are we deciding together. And so early on, when it was clear we weren't going to have the rest of the NBA season, there was a back and forth between Stephen Curry and also LeBron James, kind of sharing the reflections on, like, would we play with no fans in the stadium, or would we not? And then, overall the NBA coming down and saying, like, we will make that decision, right? And so part of me really sits with who gets to make the decision. What does it look like to engage the athletes around this piece of safety and trust that Tali has lifted up? When will they feel safe enough? When will they actually engage in a collective trust that we actually won't play if we're not feeling well enough to actually be with our teammates? What does it look like to have workers or vendors that support those facilities also engage in that same level of safety and trust, and understanding, once again, that if they can't come into those spaces, that they will still be cared for, right? Because so much of this is about the fear about the loss of income, because unfortunately we don't have that social safety net. And so, Mark, I was actually kind of curious around, are there conversations happening in the sports industry about how do we engage athletes, how do we engage the workers in making the collective decisions for the industry as opposed to just the owners?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, that's actually an easy question to answer. It does get a little bit back to Tally and saying, trust is such an important part. It's part of what, keeps me up at night about the future of Major League Baseball, is that there is such a lack of trust between the players and the league. I'm not an owner, by the way. I'm an operator, not an owner. But I think that's probably the pervasive issue. And there's a systemic and historical root to that lack of trust as well, Amaka. But there's a 67-page health protocol document that Major League Baseball came up with that literally, walks through, and then that was handed over to the Players Association or the union to say, how do you feel about this? That was handed to every public health organization in all 30 communities and said, how do you feel about this? That's been revised. And so, yeah, there's a collaborative working document that talks about not even thinking about fans yet, just players. When we think about practice, reimagining our practice facilities, reimagining travel protocol, reimagining on-field protocol, from everything from not high-fiving, not spitting, to the way we travel and commute back and forth from the ballpark. So I don't want to get granular and boring, but yes, that's been a collaborative effort. I think there are a host of other problems that exist. I've got other feelings on the building conversations we're having, but those are all, again, they pre-exist a lot of the challenges that Peter referred to and Alan has referred to. But Amaka, directly related to that, I think one, it gets back to what Tally said, like any successful effort has to be rooted in respect and trust between the athletes who are the drivers of the business and the league or the ownership that are operating many of them, by the way, very socially conscious and focused in their communities as well. And community is one of the reasons a lot of owners buy a team, is to help positively impact the community, not just turn a profit. Not all, but a lot that I've come in contact with. But that takes, trust, that takes alignment. Usually in the world that we live in North America, that takes aligned incentive as well. Like there has to be an alignment of incentive that it benefits everyone. Because trust me, no matter how incredible those people are, they're still also thinking about how does it affect me and the things that are at stake for me and my family. But thank you for asking.
May I?
Go ahead.
If we think of possible solutions or systematic reforms, I would say that one thing is to bring wireless or broadband connectivity everywhere. This is really important, and we see it now. The other thing is that, as Mark said, we see that the cultural, the creative industries are in need of rescuing, and they are in survival mode. But they are also a part of the solution, and they're also a tool for creating and contributing to the solution. And I will use a phrase suggested by Tony Attard, who's a cultural policy analyst from Malta. He said, artists are the frontliners of the soul. And they have to be part of the solution. We have to work together with artists and with stakeholders in all these industries to build the solutions. And this, for example, means linking investment in culture and the arts to broader social outcomes related to cohesion, to inclusion, to equality. And if we want to ask what this means, it could mean, for example, making sure there's artistic freedom to create and express, making sure that all parts of the country and all urban neighborhoods have equal access to the full range of cultural facilities, making sure that there are opportunities open to civil society and to cultural sector professionals to participate in decision-making processes related to cultural activities.
Thanks, Tali. And this, I'm getting some questions from the attendees really pushing for practical models. So we talk about systemic and structural change and new models, but do we have examples? Can anyone point to really specific examples for arts and cultural organizations of what are the new models that they should be thinking about implementing in their organizations, in their work?
Joanna, on that thought, one of the practices that is so difficult to move in our sector is the process of artistic decision making in institutions. It speaks directly to what Amaka referred to as who's at the table, who is, and ultimately to the idea of self-determination. And we have, in most institutions, such consolidated decision-making where we somehow got the idea decades ago that one individual would have complete artistic control over an institution and would have the breadth of knowledge and experience to make, to green light or red light everything. And I think what we're seeing actually before COVID is slow dismantling of that. And the specific example I'd give is the San Francisco Symphony, when they announced their new artistic director, also announced a whole number of advisors who have specific depth of cultural expertise. And I thought, okay, that's a step in the right direction of welcoming a plurality of voices into our institutions. Now, that's not to say that we don't need to actually, question the institutions themselves and their structure, but a good start, and I'm sure there are other examples, people can think of, where we're starting to see the breaking down of consolidation of power in artistic decision making, but that's going to die really, really hard.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm not sure if the person who asked that question is aware of what Nina Simon and her colleagues are doing in the Of by For All movement, ofbyforall.org. There are models there that are about sort of a more distributed, collaborative notion of generation of relevance and programmatic decision making. But Alan, I agree, it's not going to be easy for some kinds of organizations.
I'm happy to jump in and offer some examples. So I've had the pleasure of building a relationship with the Center for Cultural Innovation, led by Angie Kim, and they have this ambitious program. And the ambitious program is really supported in, or focuses in on supporting artists, cultural workers, across a broad definition, right, of how we understand culture, to really lift up what are the models that allow them to have ownership over the production of their work, over the way they structure their business model. And so, they have projects like the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative that is really looking at culture more around like, how do we rethink our culture of housing, right? How do we also shift people's understanding around what it means to have access to dignified housing? And then how do we actually structure the business model? And then how do we finance and resource the projects? So they're able to kind of move away from a speculative real estate market to how we understand housing to something that is actually cooperative. And I think this kind of, I forget whether it's Alan or Peter who has suggested the role of philanthropy. And while, someone who works in the philanthropic sector, I think there's many good things we can do, even though we're not a perfect field. One of the good things that I see emerging in philanthropy is a move towards into what we call integrated capital or mission-aligned investing. And so philanthropic institutions that are moving not just grants, but also investment capital in non-extractive ways that are able to feed and support some of these initiatives so that we're not just resourcing them to produce art, we're resourcing them so that they can own their art. I think another example I would lift up is a dear friend of mine, Alan Frimpong, who helped create the Zeal Collective. And so it's a cooperatively owned Black artist collective, bringing together Black artists across the country, but through a cooperative model. And so I think some of those mechanisms are ways that we're seeing people figure out how to lean into the collective shared prosperity of how they structure their business model, and then how we collectively support each other as a community of artists and cultural workers.
Yes, and Amaka, some of where that the whole ethos you're describing has sort of infiltrated in a great way. I don't mean that pejoratively. The cultural sector is under the rubric of creative placemaking, which I know Sunil Iyengar mentioned in the previous panel. That movement has been sort of broadly and messily incubating some of those strategies that you're talking about, which I think are tremendously exciting.
So Amaka, your comment is really relevant to the next question that came in, which is from our backstage at AEI room. How do we re-envision relationships between workers and organizations? And what about more unionization? And I know, Mark, this is something that you're dealing with probably a lot in your sector. So anyone who wants to jump in to answer that question.
Well, that would be the third rail of discourse. Yeah, I guess that's never stopped me, but I mean, a blessing and a curse. Amaka talked about exploitation of workers contributing to economic injustice, and we have exploitation of workers in the cultural sector. We just call them teaching artists. But we have woefully underpaid artists, and then we have fabulously compensated artists and artistic leaders paid millions. So we have, and then we have the artists who are fortunate enough to have union representation, making really, really wonderful salaries and having all sorts of protections. And then there's those who don't. So the inequities we have within our so maybe the answer is more unionization. I mean, certainly that's been a recent trend. There are plenty of people who think that would be disastrous, and there are other people who think it's a solution.
Right. I'm not sure about the means, but the end is the same thing we've been talking about on the audience and community level, which is inclusion. We can include the artists, and the we shifts from we management, including artists, to something, again, more collectivist. That's the progressive ethos that I think we have an opportunity to seize now because of these crises, or one unified crisis. Mark, everything you said about the challenges and questions that you're grappling with are a kind of perfect metaphor for what's going on in some of the performing arts, for example. You work with the league, Major League Baseball, but the league in my world is the League of American Orchestras. And they've been having, you could change a few words in what you said a few minutes ago, and it's a perfect map onto this. I wonder, when you emphasize things like, comfort of the audience to return, whether we need a broader definition of comfort. That seems to be implied in some of what's been said by the rest of you, because we've known, at least in the arts, we've known for decades that many people don't feel comfortable in our spaces. So there's some irony in this valorizing of, we need to make sure people are comfortable so they will come back. Well, what about the people who weren't there in the first place?
Right.
And the fact that we could dismiss their discomfort, even though empirically through researchers like Alan and myself and so many evaluators and researchers in the field, we knew it, we didn't act on it as a field because those were uneducated people or non-white people or somehow less important to the field than the people who were coming to the hall. Do you have anything like that parallel? I mean, is there a sense of,
Yeah, I mean, this might be a rather mundane response in light of the levity of this conversation, but we were already, having gone through a major renovation when I ran the Cleveland Indians and undergoing a consideration of a whole new stadium project here and thinking about live entertainment and stadium experience and how consumers take in entertainment, sport, everything. Basically in the most simplistic way, the evolution of the stadium and ballpark experience, and I have theater experience. We engaged theater architects as well when we thought about things as, changing the experience from one seat. I'm sorry, the same experience, and the only thing that changes is the seat you sit in, the vantage point of the vision, to a very targeted, community-based, segmented, range of experiences throughout a stadium, so that different people that want to experience a baseball game in different ways have a wealth of offerings that whatever makes them most comfortable. And inclusiveness is a part of that as well. But it's thinking about, where does the family go that they feel safe from people who are not wanting to experience the game in the same way? Where does the baseball traditionalist go that still wants to sit with a pencil and a scorecard? Where does a young person go who actually doesn't want to watch the game, just wants to be at the game and with their community? And those are again, I'm almost embarrassed to even talk about those things in light of the more important social issues that are going on in the backdrop of this call. But when I think about, those were things we were already thinking about and talking about. Those are things, if you go to best in class stadium design, they call the sections of their ballparks neighborhoods. That's what they call them. They call them neighborhoods because they are designed to make people feel part of the community. They're designed to make people want to be there. And I don't think we have the luxury. And again, I'm comfortable saying in the entertainment industry, in the live entertainment industry, whether it's a festival, whether it's a concert, whether it is theater, whatever it is, we do not have the long-term luxury of just saying, just doing what we do is good enough for sustainability. I think we need to think about the word compelling. How do we create compelling experiences? Because the nature of mobility and then the nature of the desire not to leave our home, our support network, but this is even more relevant with what we're undergoing right now, and the nature of the fact that we can get every single thing we need right here and don't have to go anywhere, means that we have to differentiate our experience. We have to think very open-minded, very creative, and we have to think about being more inclusive, that we're not limited to the same audience we've always been limited to. So I'm trying to expand what already is in my head, but I can tell you, A, Peter, we were already there. We're aware of that. B, I think that this just accentuates that reality. And then C, I want to get back to Tally a little bit. I am still hopeful. I still feel sport culture provides a path back to normalcy, provides a sense of hope. I am optimistic. I just think that the path from here to there is going to be a tough one for all of us. It's going to take time, and it's going to take open-mindedness, which is really the spirit of this call, which is that we need to be open-minded. We can't be trapped in the models that we've thought about for so long, and that are, in our case, our profitable industry, largely because of being content for media, has provided us the ability to kind of live in. So that's a mouthful, but that's my, those are some thoughts for you.
Ali, I'll let you jump in here.
Thank you. I think it's becoming evident that the sectors we're talking about will be hit hard. We're seeing statistics that 1 in 8 museums may never reopen, and the same goes for other cultural organizations. It's going to be very difficult for people who work there and for the consumers. And again, I would like to emphasize that one solution, one example of how to deal with that is those mediated interactions we mentioned. So digital technology is becoming more important and more prevalent, mediating between the consumer and the artwork or the cultural activity or the sports event. And this is why, again, internet connectivity, internet literacy is going to be extremely important, as well as rethinking the spatial distribution, which I already mentioned. Because this is an opportunity for people, rather than to go to the big city to visit the museum, to see a dance company that they like and so on. They might prefer spending time in their neighborhoods, in their local cultural initiatives, take part in local events and further develop what's happening in their own neighborhood, city, region, etc. And I think this is something practical that we can think about and we can strengthen. And this is a reasonable solution to some of the problems that we raised.
Thanks, Tali. I want to end with one last question for the whole panel that came from an attendee. But we've talked about changes. We've talked about new systems. What happens tomorrow we get a vaccine and we go back to the way that life was? What's our time frame for making these changes? Or if we don't have a long time frame, or if we don't know, how do we make sure that these changes get made?
Well, that's really a question about leadership, Joanna. Spiritual, moral, aesthetic, cultural leadership. You know, we have so much of it in our sector, but perhaps it's not organized as well as it needs to be. You know, a topic for another day, Joanna, is how does our sector respond to the research needs in an emergency? You know, Peter and I are sitting here because we took initiative. But if we waited to do this, you know, our sector's need for information should not depend on Alan's Rolodex or Peter's Rolodex or what the people at a particular foundation in New York are smoking on a given day. You know, we need better policy. We need, you know, policy-driven leadership. We have the leaders. So, you know, if we get a vaccine and things open back up, you know, we need to have the leadership to say, wait a minute, we need new models and we need them now. And we actually need to experiment outside of the nonprofit system, which Amaka is something I know that Angie Kim is doing at the Center for Cultural Innovation is so important, is to not take the 501c3 as the be all and end all of cultural production. So anyway, I think we can do it, but it's going to take kind of leadership.
Peter.
I hope that in a way the question is about whether the light having been turned on about our sort of standing, as I said earlier, or our complicity as a field, as a history, as a category that is derived from European definitions, right? That the cultural sector won't be able to turn that light off, because the changes and the sort of utility that may flow from those changes could be enormous, enormous. It's enormously important that we don't treat this as a kind of odd moment due to the pandemic, that when the pandemic recedes, will also recede. And I guess I'm not sure that's any different from what Alan is just saying, but I think right now I'm seeing two kinds of, you know, leaders in the field: those who are willing to do the hard work of reflection and go beyond the rhetoric of saying it to the New York Times when they're interviewed, and those who are really sort of putting at stake and on the table their institutional prerogatives and their kind of historical consolidation of power. And you know where my heart lies, right? I mean, I think the benefits and innovations are all going to be on one side of that equation.
If I can add, can I add to that?
Sure, go ahead, Tali.
I absolutely agree with both Alan and Peter. Leadership is really important, but also citizenship and activism. And I think we're seeing some of that. I think that the fact that this is a global issue, global crisis, works to our advantage because we're all feeling the consequences. And all over the world, people like us have been sitting for many weeks now, trying to figure out what's next and what can be done and how to rebuild and how to rehabilitate. And also the fact that that restoring the cultural sector, the creative industries, has tremendous economic consequences also works to our advantage, because those interests will be very difficult to ignore when economic interests are also at play.
Mark, any last words?
I mean, the only thing I'd probably say is obviously I'm a big believer in the power of leadership and what it can do and mean. I feel like vaccine or not, that we've undergone a concurrent set of conditions that have created momentum, and that is not going to be a lot of positive momentum. That's going to force people to reconsider a lot of things rather than just revert back to normal. And I think that and I guess I get back to my optimistic side and my hopeful side, that I feel like there is momentum for positive change, certainly within North America right now. But as Tally mentions, this is a global, we are in this in a truly global community together. And so I just don't think things are going to flip back to normal, regardless of what that means from a capitalistic sense or any other sense. I think that we have all been forced to reconsider so deeply so many things. And then concurrent with that, the social movement that is pervasive in all of our minds and in all of our hearts and souls right now, so that I feel like combined, we've kind of crossed a threshold that we're not going back, to the way things were. A new abnormal, a new normal, whatever that looks like. I tend to believe and be bullish that it's going to be a better one. It's going to take time, it's going to take effort, and certainly has to coincide with the incentives that we all live with as realities. But I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic. I guess I'd end with that.
Thank you, Mark. And last, Amaka.
Sure. I'll start with my closing comments with, once again, with Mark. I just want to offer, as someone who really, once again, enjoys the sports, that for me, one of the reasons it was actually really important to have this sports industry sector conversation alongside this one is that, unfortunately, right, I wish it wasn't this way, the sports sector, from football to NBA to baseball and so many other sports, has been one of the very few arenas where Black, Indigenous communities of color have actually seen themselves prominently represented, right? And so when I take my godson to an Oakland A's game and he got to see Coco Crisp play, that moved him. And so that's also why these conversations are extremely important. I live 10 minutes away from the A's stadium. And that's one of the very few places where young Black people who live in deep East Oakland can feel like they can gather safely. So I just want to say, I don't want to actually trivialize this piece about the sports industry. I do think it's really important in terms of what it has meant. And hopefully, these conversations around racial equity will continue to grow. And I think finally to this piece around like what happens if we get a vaccine, I think everybody has said it, but I will just echo it. We know so much more now than we did earlier this year. And so if we actually choose to kind of go back to what once was, we are walking away from the values that I've heard so many of us speak to, the values that our institutions claim to uphold. And so the opportunity to continue to push our institutions further, to operationalize their values within their business model, how they engage with consumers and producers is essential. And so with this, I would, there's two questions that I always leave my clients with. The first question being, who gets to make the decisions and how are those decisions being made, right? So always really being able to understand who has the power and what we're implementing. And then the other piece being, who is financially benefiting and how are they financially benefiting, right? Are they benefiting off of the extraction, exploitation of somebody else's labor, or are they actually engaging in sharing of revenue and profits? And those two pieces oftentimes help us to really then understand, are we replicating the systems where white, wealthier individuals continue to benefit at the expense of low-income, marginalized communities, or are we starting to move towards something that's more equitable and more redistributed? And so just want to thank my panelists. I thought this was a wonderful conversation. Joanna, thanks for hosting us, and I hope to continue more of it.
Thank you, Amaka. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Alan, Tali, and Peter.
Thank you.
Such a lovely time this hour and close to 20 minutes. And I hope everybody who's watching will stick around for our final panel, which starts in about 10 minutes. But thank you again, everybody. And we will continue this conversation offline.
Thank you all. Great to know your work.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Well.